Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, in the Academy of Motivation and Education for the 22nd time in this series that we are running. It's a series of lectures and workshops on trauma, on war trauma, and preparation to help actually people who are experiencing these traumatic events so that we can help them in all kinds of dramatic situations they've been encountering. As you know, we have a huge group of participants here. As you know, it's a series of micro trainings that are being organized by the Academy of Education and Motivation in fantastic cooperation with Professor Robert Lee. We're very grateful to it and for it to the professor, and he appreciates that there are people who want to get trained to get as well prepared on these topics, and we're really grateful to all of you here that you really want to dedicate your time to go deeper in this subject. Today it's an incredible opportunity, an incredible event, because we have Professor Cory Newman with us, who will be sharing some thoughts on a very important and serious matter, meaning prevention of suicide situations, suicide ideation. So in this training, we will have a look at how to identify those signs, how to teach our clients to track these signs, these warning signs that point to the risk of suicide. We could go on talking about Professor Cory Newman for a long time. He's a great representative of cognitive behavioral therapy. He's a supervisor, researcher, academic, and practitioner of CBT, author of many books and academic papers on various matters, difficult matters related to psychotherapy. And today, this is one of those difficult topics, that is the threat of suicide. So thank you very much for being here with us. We're really honored. And the floor is yours. We're eager to hear every word you have to share. Thank you.
Very good. This topic is, of course, extremely important for so many reasons, and I hope to give it the attention it deserves in a short space of time. I want to express appreciation for all of you, for all of the extremely important and valuable work that you are doing, making a great contribution to humanity, for all the help that you are giving so many people who are traumatized and displaced. The talk I'm going to give about preventing suicide will pertain to people in general who have risk for suicide, but it will also pertain specifically to people who are refugees of the sort that you are helping right now. So allow me to advance. Objectives, well, for example, we want to understand how there is an interaction between adverse life situations, such as war trauma, but also cognitive vulnerabilities, how those factors interact to increase risk of suicide. And that's true for the general population as well as for traumatized refugees. A second objective of this talk is to present a range, a variety of relational and cognitive behavioral interventions to reduce the risk of suicide and promote hope and purpose. And notice I say relational interventions, not just cognitive behavioral. In fact, the two go together. In fact, Aaron T. Beck himself always said that the relational side of cognitive behavioral therapy is as important and should be emphasized. And you will see that in my presentation. And third, maybe not as much, but a little bit, we will talk about taking care of yourself as a clinician when you are working so many hours with people who are so traumatized, who have lost so much. And it gives you a sense of secondary trauma as well. What can we do to help ourselves? Worldwide, it's a very big problem, as you may know. There are 800,000 confirmed suicides per year internationally, but the World Health Organization recognizes that some countries do not submit their data on suicide, and so they extrapolate and round the number to a figure closer to 1 million per year, which is very difficult to comprehend. And also, for each adult who has died, each adult, not just children, but for each adult who has died of suicide, there may have been more than 20 others who have attempted. So the good news, if we can call it good news, is that most people who try suicide do not complete the suicide. The bad news is that it still means that in the world each year, about 20 million people want to die by suicide. It's beyond imagination. Suicide can occur throughout the lifespan from childhood to old age, and it is in fact the second leading cause of death among people between the ages of 15 and 29, only behind accidents. Let's talk about some risk factors. And again, we'll talk about risk factors in general and risk factors that are very specific to refugees. So this part is for the general population, though it can also pertain to the people that you're seeing from Ukraine. Social isolation is a risk factor. Living alone, having been recently through a breakup of a relationship, a divorce, perceived rejection and abandonment. It may not even be a true rejection and abandonment, just a perception that one is rejected and abandoned could be a risk factor for a suicide attempt. And also a belief about being a burden, that, you know, my existence is a burden to my family. It's a burden to the people who have invited me into their home. I don't want to be a burden. I would rather die than be a burden. Unemployment and financial worries can be a risk factor for suicide. As you can see, when people have had their lives greatly disrupted by war and displacement, now they no longer have their job. They wonder if they have access to their money. They wonder if they will be able to rebuild their lives for themselves, for their families. It's a very big worry. And also academic difficulties can be a risk factor. The belief that I am failing, I will not achieve, I will not graduate, I will disappoint my family, I will never achieve the goals I set out to do. Alcohol and other substance misuse, both acutely and chronically, are risk factors. And I'll tell you a bit about both. So the chronic factor, of course, is for people who have actual addictive disorders. There are health problems, there is a lack of functioning, and many problems have resulted from chronic impairment, from chronic alcohol and drug use. Financial problems, family problems, self-esteem problems. These are chronic risk factors. But there can also be acute risk factors, such as when a person has had too much to drink, they have used drugs, and now they are disinhibited. Now maybe when they were sober, they would not have thought about trying suicide, but now that they are feeling inebriated, now they have the courage, I put that in quotes, they have the courage to try suicide when they would not have if they were in a straight, sober state of mind. Chronic pain and medical illness is a big risk factor, and there are limitations to what we can do. Fortunately, there is a full literature on managing chronic pain, both in terms of pharmacotherapy, but also in terms of cognitive behavioral therapy. But for any of you who have ever gone through chronic pain yourselves, you know that it can really make you want to escape completely, escape from life entirely, just to stop the pain. So we have a lot of work to do to help people to find reasons to live when they are going through so much pain, how to manage that pain. It's a big risk factor. A history of sexual victimization is something which makes someone vulnerable throughout their lives. It's a range. For some people, it's less of a vulnerability factor, and for others, it is more. But it is almost always a vulnerability factor into the future, including risk of suicide. Then, of course, we have risk factors that pertain to suicide itself. So if a person that you are now assessing for the first time in therapy, they have a history of high suicidal ideation. Even if they say today they do not have such high suicidal ideation, the fact that they have had this in the past is still a risk factor. Similarly, if there is a history of self-harming behavior, even if they say to you that it was not their intent to die, that, okay, yes, I used to cut my wrists. Yes, I used to take a cigarette and burn myself. I didn't want to die. I just wanted to punish myself. I just wanted to feel something because I was feeling so numb. Even though they say it's not to create death, it's still a risk factor for future suicide. And of course, this is very apparent, very obvious. When people who have tried suicide in the past, they are at higher risk for trying suicide again in the future. And thinking about the research done by Thomas Joyner, he and his team have shown that people who have 2 or more past suicide attempts are even more at risk for future suicide, more so than people who have had 1 suicide attempt. So the more past attempts, the more the risk. And a family history of suicide, especially if it's within the immediate family. If your patient says, yes, my father killed himself. Yes, I have an uncle and a brother who died by suicide. Big risk factor. Then there are broader sociological risk factors that interact with the cognitive behavioral factors, such as being the object of continuous bullying. And in this day and age, the bullying can happen 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because the bullying can take place on your phone, via the internet, via social media. In previous generations, you could stay home and avoid being bullied. You could stay home from school and maybe get homeschooling if the environment at school was too hostile. But now a person can be bullied around the clock through their phone, through their computer. It's a risk factor. There is a contagion factor, meaning suicide can be a bit contagious in the sense that we have empirical evidence. And one study I cited was by Howard and Donna Sudak. And I should mention that Donna Sudak, I think, in my opinion, is one of the world's leading psychiatrists who is a cognitive behavioral therapist. And Donna Sudak, I think, in my opinion, has written the best book on the subject of combining cognitive behavioral therapy and pharmacotherapy. So I have great respect for Donna Sudak. But she and her husband wrote a paper about 17 years ago that showed that even when we statistically remove other factors out of the equation, the notion that suicide occurs in clusters, that there is a contagiousness, that if one student in a school completes a suicide, other students may soon complete suicide. It's a true thing. And there have been examples in the States, in various places, in Texas and California, where there were a number of suicides in one school. And part of this is because the suicides are well publicized as well, for example, in the media. Chronic discrimination. This is a topic in itself. This merits a full day lecture by itself. I will only give it 1 minute, but it's very important. And that is that when people have suffered chronic lifelong discrimination because of race, because of gender, because of sexual orientation, gender orientation, it's a risk factor for suicide. It's one of the reasons that, for example, people who identify as gay have a higher risk factor for suicide than those who identify as straight. And this is another topic that could be its own entire lecture, and I will only give it less than 1 minute, but it is important to mention. And that is the indoctrination of people who follow a leader, the leader who says, here is the reason why we must leave the earth. We will all put on our white robes and ascend to a mountain, and where we will all take our lives and be rescued by some great being and taken to another planet. Or a political group that says, if you kill yourself and kill many other people who are our enemies, you are a hero. We will do great things for your family. So there's this influence of other people, of leaders, of people who will convince you that suicide is a good thing and you must do it and you will be rewarded for your suicide. So there's an indoctrination, which is a very big sociological factor that deserves its own lecture. I think in our own clinical practice, it's very rare that we will ever see someone, a patient, who has suicidal ideation because of indoctrination. But many of these other factors, chronic discrimination, hopeless thoughts, feeling like they're a burden, feeling rejected, worrying about their employment, worrying about academic failure, friends dying by suicide, family history of suicide. You will see all of those things in your practice. Borrowing from some recent publications, and I should say that although I have not specified the exact reference for each of these papers, I welcome you to contact me if you wish. The final slide of this presentation contains my email address, and I recognize I will not have time to answer most of the questions that you will put in the chat box, but I would like to try my best to answer your questions, including questions about the references, if you would like a specific citation in its completion, or even the paper itself. Many of these citations, I actually have the papers and I have the right to send them to people for academic purposes. So if you wish to have them, you can please use my email address that you will find on the final slide to request these papers. There is evidence that there is a higher prevalence of suicide in refugee populations than in the general population. Now, I should mention that in those studies, the ranges are very large. So we have to interpret things carefully. When you see a range such as 5% to 33%, you begin to wonder what is real. But I think there is enough evidence to say that the prevalence is higher for refugees than for the general population. How much higher? I think we need more data. And the risk factor for suicide in refugees is even higher still if the refugees are detained, if they are held in detention camps. And thankfully, this is not the case in Poland. Again, I think that the people of Poland are making a great contribution to humanity because they are being so welcoming and making such a personal effort to house people from Ukraine in their own homes. So they have the comforts of interacting in a home with families. It's a remarkable contribution, a remarkable achievement. And it is in itself reducing the risk of suicide for those who are fleeing the war. So again, thank you so much. When one is fleeing war, there are multiple losses. Loss of family and friends. That could be loss of contact, and it could also be loss by death. Loss of language, loss of culture. Though again, if we look at the situation of Ukraine and Poland as neighboring countries, there are similarities in language and similarities in culture. It's not the same thing. It is still an adaptation. It is still very stressful. But there's enough similarity that perhaps that helps to decrease the sense of loss of language and culture. There is, of course, loss of homeland, loss of status. Someone who may have been very highly educated, highly employed, have a very positive reputation in their city where they lived before. Now they're just like anybody else. And maybe that will change with time. But in the beginning, they are just a displaced person like the next person. Loss of contact with their community, with their neighbors, and also ongoing exposure to physical risk. We see this, of course, in the travels, the very, very dangerous, frightening travels people from Ukraine have had to make just to get into Poland. And in other areas of the world where there are refugees, you know, the dangers of taking a boat across the sea, the dangers of being in detention and perhaps being victimized while they are in detention. All of these create higher stress factors and therefore higher risk factors for suicide. And of course, direct traumatic experiences make everything worse. Everybody who is fleeing from war is traumatized, but some people have actually seen things with their own eyes. They have seen their neighborhoods destroyed. They have seen people die. They have held someone that they love dying in their arms. Direct trauma is even worse. But of course, even if you didn't have the direct trauma, even if you fled by train and didn't see your home destroyed and didn't see somebody die, it's still a tremendous trauma. Also, I mentioned in the footer to check out the meta-analysis by Sohrab AMiE, which is also a very important paper that I have a copy of. More stress factors for refugees. Complicated grief. Grief in general, if you look at a study by Latham and Prigerson, grief in general raises the risk level for suicide for anybody for a period of time. Complicated grief is even more of a risk factor. What is complicated grief? Well, to put it briefly, it has to do with either strong mixed emotions. So for example, I would have a complicated grief if someone died who was close to me, but we had a very conflicted relationship. But I loved this person, but for many, many years we were not speaking. But I really wanted to reconcile, but we never had the chance because we had a very bad argument and it fractured our family. But I still think about this person, but now it's too late. That's complicated grief. But complicated grief can also mean grief that is due to death out of the natural order of things, such as a war situation, not because a person died of a horrible illness, which is terrible, which is tragic, but it's not an unusual, complicated death in the way that suddenly one day you're just going about your business and the next day your apartment block is being attacked by missiles. Worrying about loved ones left behind. We know that many people who have fled Ukraine have loved ones back in Ukraine, and they worry every moment of every day about those people. That's a risk factor. Survivor guilt. Why did I live? Why am I safe? And people I care about have died. And of course, things like financial loss and stress and lots of uncertainty about the future. What will the future bring? Will I ever be able to go home again? Will I ever have my job as an architect again, or as an attorney ever again? What kind of life will my children have? They have to learn a new language. Will they be able to achieve anything in the way they could have if they had stayed at home in a normal time? I mentioned before, I'll mention it once more. The sense of being a burden is a risk factor, is a stress factor for refugees. One of the things we can do as clinicians, and if you are hosting somebody in your own home, is to send the message that they are not a burden. We feel confident that they would do the same thing for us if we were the person being traumatized. They would help us out, and this is actually part of just being at one with the human community. And so, in some respects, it is an opportunity. It is a blessing to be able to give this help. It is not a burden. It may be work. It may require us to do more problem solving, but there is a gift involved as well that removes some of that burden. And we can communicate that to people who feel like they are an undue burden. Of course, there are language barriers, ambivalence about whether to stay in the safe country or return home. Many people right now who are safely in Poland are wondering, well, should I return? Should I return to my home where so many people still remain? Should I return to, right now, there are no active hostilities in my particular part of Ukraine, but at any given time that could change. There are still missile strikes on our infrastructure, sirens of air raids. So there really isn't a safe place, but is it safe enough that I should go back home? Is it better than being here? That's a tremendous stress and strain of uncertainty and ambivalence. Remember that many people, even before the war began, were suffering from depression or anxiety problems or OCD or PTSD, trauma from early childhood sexual abuse, trauma from severe accidents, and they were already being treated. But now they have an additional major stressor, which is displacement because of war. And now that exacerbates their already existing mental health condition. And now they don't have their regular healthcare and mental health care practitioners. So that just adds on. So of course, when you do your assessment of any of these people in your clinical practice, as you customarily do, please take a very thorough history, find out what sort of psychological difficulties the patients may have had even before the onset of a war that whose insanity is exceeded only by its tragedy. There are factors that help refugees: the belief that they are accepted by the safe country, a high level of social support, which you are providing, access to healthcare and mental health care services that you are providing. Trying to keep the family together as much as possible. This is not always possible, but it is a goal. It's a goal to try to bring family members together if possible. And also to help give people who are displaced the chance to continue in their daily and weekly routines of receiving an education and being employed. All of this is a work in progress. All of this requires a lot of problem solving, a lot of cooperation from the government, from the communities. Very, very difficult. It's a heroic effort to help displaced persons to resume education and employment. And of course, if they can adapt to new language and new culture, that is very helpful as well. And because of Ukraine and Poland being neighboring countries, it helps a little bit, but it doesn't help completely. When we assess for suicide risk, here are 4 questionnaires. And I present them because 2 of them represent interview questionnaires and 2 of them represent self-report, and because all of them have versions in Polish language and Ukrainian language. There are many other forms that you can use to assess suicide risk, but these are 4 I've chosen for convenience. One is the Columbia, as in Columbia University in New York, the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale. That's an interview-based assessment. The Patient Health Questionnaire, especially the final question, which addresses suicidal ideation, that's interview-based. And then there are a couple of self-report forms, the Short Hopelessness Scale, which is based on the Beck Hopelessness Scale, and the Beck Depression Inventory, in particular items 2 and 9 on the Beck Depression Inventory, which focus on suicide risk and hopelessness. Any of these would be useful methods of assessing, in addition to your verbal assessment, your natural questions that you ask as part of your routine assessment. Hopefully you can obtain forms, versions in Polish language and Ukrainian language as necessary for your patients. In assessing for suicide risk, it's useful to think in terms of intention and level of lethality as separate issues. Yes, of course, the 2 things interact, but we want to think of them as separate things. Let me explain. Okay, let's talk about level of intent, level of intention to try suicide. Factors to ask about. One is preparation. How much time and effort did a person put into planning, preparing? Like someone who says, okay, you know, I told my husband to please take our 2 boys on a little trip to our cabin in the mountains. And I said, I will join them in 2 days, but I won't. But they'll go to the mountains and I will tell them I'm doing other things. Meanwhile, while they're gone, I will take an overdose, but not at home. I have reserved a room in a hotel far away. I don't want them to come home and find me dead. That would be a trauma. So I will go to a hotel. I will take all of my pills that I have stored from my prescriptions. I will take those pills and I will die. And my husband and my boys will be in the mountain cabin and they won't know and they can't stop me. That's a lot of preparation. That's a lot of thought that this person put into a suicide attempt. That tells you that their intent is very, very high. I should say, it does not mean that if someone is impulsive in their suicide attempt, that somehow it's not significant. It is. This is all relative, that things such as preparing in great detail is a sign of high intent. But please still take everything else seriously. The sense of confidence, the sense that, yeah, I could do it. I could die. I could do it. I'm not afraid. I can do it. I can take a gun and kill myself. I can take all those pills and not be afraid. I can jump off the top of the building. It doesn't frighten me. I'll just drink a lot of wine and I'll do it. Okay, that sense of confidence is a risk factor of intent, much more so than someone who says, yeah, I think about dying a lot, but I don't think I have the courage to do it. I'm just, no, I hate pain, but I hate being alive. I think about my funeral, but I don't like pain. I don't know. I don't think I can do it. They may still be at risk. Please do not relax. They're still in danger, but their level of intent is lower than someone who says, yes, I could do it, no problem. Level of secretiveness, like the example I gave with preparation, she was very secret about trying suicide. She didn't tell her husband how she felt. She didn't tell her doctor how she felt. She didn't tell her friends how she felt. Nobody knew because she did not want anyone to stop her. That's a very high level of intent. Again, on the other side of the coin, if someone talks about suicide a lot, they're not keeping it a secret. Don't relax. They may still be at risk, but maybe a little bit less at risk than someone who is keeping it secret, because the person who's keeping it secret really does not want anyone to stop them. The person who's talking about it, they may be very serious, but maybe there's a little part of their brain that says, I really hope somebody cares enough to hear me and try to stop me and show that they care about me. And the beliefs about the purpose of suicide. If they believe that, well, yeah, I want to die because I want to escape. I want to end my pain and suffering. I want to actually die. Not because I want to really show people how much pain I'm in. That's still a serious thing. But when the intent is escape and die, that's a higher level of intent than when someone says, my intent is to finally show my family that I'm serious when I tell them I'm depressed. Okay, that's a problem. But at least there we know that their purpose is communication. They want to communicate how depressed they are. We can teach them as clinicians how to communicate more effectively without putting their lives at risk. How about lethality? About the level of the likelihood that a particular method of trying suicide will complete a suicide. There are certain methods that have high level of lethality. Use of a firearm is a very high level. Jumping from a high height, high level. Hanging oneself. Using a car to deliberately crash, to crash into a wall, to crash into a river, to crash off a bridge. Hopefully not to crash into somebody else, but sometimes that happens tragically. And also to use a car for gas, for asphyxiation, to put the hose inside and to have carbon monoxide poisoning. High level of lethality, much more so than things such as pills or cutting, although those are very high risk in their own right, but you can change your mind. If you take pills, if you cut yourself, there's time to change your mind. You can say, what have I done? Let me call, call for the police, call for an ambulance. Let me tell my mother and she'll call an ambulance. You can change your mind, but you really cannot change your mind if you jump from a high height or you begin to hang yourself and so forth. Impulsive acts can be very lethal, such as if a person owns a firearm and they drink heavily, and now suddenly they feel that they're brave and they can take the gun and kill themselves. So combine being impaired with alcohol and drugs with being impulsive, and now you have something like a gun. It's a high risk. That's why it's very important as part of the suicide safety plan, which I will talk about soon enough, to reduce access to things like a firearm, which is a big problem in the US, as you know well. And I could talk for a very long time about the craziness in the US and states about guns. I will spare you all of that political talk, but it makes me very angry. Level of lethality can be misperceived by people. So for example, someone who says, oh, I just took some pills and drank a little bit. I don't want to die. I just want to, sleep for 3 days because I hate my life and I can't face my life. And they may underestimate that for those particular pills that they took, if you combine it with alcohol, you could die. Oh, but I only took 10 pills. I heard I have to take about 40 pills. No, if you take 10 pills and you also take 10 drinks, you could die. So they might misperceive it and not try to die, but actually die. So let's keep that in mind too. Then there are, of course, cognitive vulnerabilities. And before I get into that, let me mention one more thing that's important about assessing suicide risk. If you are talking to a patient, a new patient, and you are taking a history about, have they had suicidal ideation in the past? Have they tried suicide in the past? If they say yes, that they have tried in the past, ask them questions such as, did they have injury? Was there an injury that required medical attention? Like, were they in an unconscious semi-coma state, for example? That would be an important medical consequence that we should know about. And was the suicide attempt interrupted, either by themselves or by somebody else? And I'll give you an example about how it's very easy to underestimate the severity of past suicide attempts unless you ask about these factors specifically. Here's an example. A fellow who said at the intake, at the initial evaluation, said that he had come close to suicide in the past. Therapist asked him, well, what happened? Did you have an injury of some sort? Did you have did you actually harm yourself? Oh, no, there was no harm at all, no physical harm. Did you go to hospital? No, didn't go to hospital. Okay, your first thought could be, okay, it wasn't a big risk. But ask, was the suicide attempt interrupted? He said, oh, yes. What happened? Well, what happened was he was very intent on dying, high intent and high lethality. He was going to hang himself. He had the noose around his neck. He was standing on the chair, thinking about, okay, he was trying to get his courage to kick the chair and then hang and die. His phone was across the room on a table. He saw his phone light up. It was a text message. He was curious. Who is texting me? He takes the noose off, gets off the chair, walks across the room, looks at his phone. It's his brother. The brother says, I've got basketball tickets for tonight. Are you free? Do you want to go see the 76ers play basketball tonight? Yeah, it sounds pretty good. I think I'll go. That was an interrupted, serious suicide attempt. And he was still at risk now, just because the brother saved his life. That was a big, fortunate situation that the brother saved his life in that moment. But that patient is still very much at risk now. That's an interrupted, serious suicide attempt, even though there was no injury at all. It's a very complicated topic to really assess well. So to add to our complexities, let's talk about cognitive vulnerabilities in the suicidal patient. I will talk in general, and then I will talk about some specifics. So let's talk about the generalities. Hopelessness and helplessness. There is a huge literature, a lot of empirical work, a lot of data that demonstrates that thinking that nothing I do makes a difference, nothing I do matters, and things will never get better. They'll just get worse and worse. Helplessness and hopelessness are big cognitive risk factors for suicide. When you think that it doesn't matter what I do and the future is beyond solving. Also, maladaptive schemas. Some or many of you may be familiar with schema therapy, which is very related to traditional cognitive behavioral therapy. You may be familiar with works of people like Jeffrey Young, Arnold Arntz, who have taken schema therapy to a whole new level. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Also, suicidogenic beliefs, which I worked on with my colleague, Thomas Ellis. 6 basic areas of belief that prime someone to be at risk for suicide. It's coming up in a minute. Poor problem solving. There is some data in the field that people with risk of suicide have more actual problems than people who are not feeling suicidal, but they have fewer problem solving skills than the people who are feeling well. So more problems, but less problem-solving skills. It's not a good combination. So we really want to help our patients to become better problem solvers. This is an interesting topic from the depression literature that was then applied more specifically to people who are suicidal. The non-specific autobiographical recall literature, also called overgeneralized memory. So non-specific, overgeneralized, kind of the same thing, where people have a very difficult time really remembering the specifics of the past. They just remember that they were miserable, they were traumatized, but they don't remember very much of the details. It's hard for them to tell you the lessons that they've learned through all of the difficulties they've been through in life. We want to help them become much more specific in their recall, to tell the story of their life, to write a narrative of their life. Because the more specifically they can think about their past, the more lessons to be learned about how to live successfully. Unfortunately, if they're very overgeneral in their memory, they don't get those lessons in life. They just think, I'm a terrible person, life is terrible, there's no point in living. Now, I'm being overgeneral by saying it so simply, but I'll tell you more. And also perfectionism is a risk factor, but not just any kind of perfectionism, not just the kind of perfectionism that is about high ambition, not the kind of perfectionism which is maybe related to obsessive compulsive disorder. It's more like a morbid, self-punitive perfectionism. It's where the thought, if I'm not perfect, I'm worthless. If I'm not perfect, my life is a failure. If I'm not perfect, I should die. And punishing oneself for not being perfect. This is a whole other level. It's the punishing part of it. It's the part that makes even achievements not seem enjoyable. That's what we're aiming for in our therapy. More on that coming up. Tunnel vision. Seeing things in a very narrow field. And you know, as you do cognitive behavioral therapy, that one of our goals in general with our patients is to help them to broaden their perspectives, to see things with a broader lens, to get a bigger perspective on life, to stretch and flex their thinking. Sometimes I call it cognitive yoga. You know, stretch and flex your mind as if your mind is having yoga lessons. And as you know, for those of you who do yoga, and many of your patients may do yoga, that when you practice yoga, your body is more flexible. And a flexible body is less likely to be injured. Similarly, when your cognitions are flexible, you're less likely to have mental injury because you can see things more broadly. And as a therapist, it helps you to validate your patient's viewpoints. You don't have to say, and I never say this, but it's a stereotype of CBT. It's an incorrect stereotype that a CBT therapist will say, your thoughts are irrational. Don't think irrational thoughts. You should think this way, which is rational. Stop the irrational and think in rational way. And I will tell you how to think rationally. That is not good CBT. That is not sophisticated relational therapy. Instead, we have to validate. We have to look for the truth in what our patients are saying. It's their life. It's their experience. They are the experts on them. We are the experts in cognitive behavioral therapy. We bring those two areas of expertise together in a collaboration, and it creates a synergy. Their expertise about their life, our expertise about CBT, it's very powerful. So how does this relate to tunnel vision? We validate that this little area of tunnel vision that they are seeing about their life is true. This is a cross section of their life. If their life is this big circle, their tunnel vision is a cross section, and what they're seeing is true, but they're not seeing the whole totality of their lives. We want to stretch out. And by looking at the totality, not just the thin cross section, the tunnel, it changes perception. It changes your level of self-efficacy. It changes your level of hope, because now you see other options. That's one of our big goals of CBT, not to invalidate people's perceptions. In risk of suicide, another cognitive vulnerability are time distortions. It's a very interesting phenomenon. There's less literature on this. So this is a bit more speculation, I should say, compared to all the other factors. But we begin to test hypotheses. We start with speculation. This is how it begins. This is how we generate hypotheses. So I'm generating a hypothesis for you about distorting time. For example, a person who is in great emotional pain may feel that that pain that they're feeling is it may be happening right now, but it seems to last forever. It seems to be eternal, this pain that they're feeling, this a lonely feeling, alone all night, feeling rejected, feeling abandoned. This night seems like eternity. But the idea that maybe if I kill myself, I will be dead for all of eternity, for 15 trillion years, or whatever the time frame is, if you study the cosmos, that doesn't seem significant. So the night of being alone seems like eternity, but being dead for actual eternity seems not important. That's kind of an inversion, a paradoxical inversion of time. And also, speaking more at a cosmic level, feelings about pain and suffering and wanting to end the pain and suffering is almost like a black hole. It's like a collapsing neutron star. Everything collapses to a point of singularity, just this one point in the universe where everything has densely packed together into a black hole. There's no future. There's no past. There's no this way. There's no that way. There's just this point of pain that I must end. So part of our work as therapists is to go beyond that black hole. It's not possible astronomically, but it is possible psychologically, to think about the past, to think about the narrative of their life, everything that they've done to this point to get to now, the importance of what they've accomplished, who they are, what they've experienced, who they've cared about, where they have been, what they have learned, and the future, what is still possible. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. I keep saying that. But they don't see that. They just see right this moment, kill the moment. But if you kill the moment, you kill your history and you kill your future. Let's honor your history and let's be curious about your future. Hopelessness factor. It's not just people who are depressed and hopeless who have risk of suicide, though of course they are at high risk. But even when someone is not clinically depressed, their level of baseline hopelessness, how hopeless are they in everyday life, even when not depressed, is a risk factor. So the person that you work with, he's not depressed, but everyone knows that he's very cynical, he's a pessimist. Oh, that's Joseph. He's a cynical pessimist. He's probably feeling very hopeless. And if he gets depressed, that's a big risk factor because he's already cynical and pessimistic at baseline when he's not depressed. So we as clinicians want to assess for hopelessness under any conditions, depressed or not. Schemas. I will not talk about schema therapy. It's too much for our purposes, but I want to at least acknowledge that the schemas, the broad pervasive themes or patterns that we learn early in life that can be very harmful, play a role in risk factor for suicide. So as Jeffrey Young and Arnold Arns talk about, and all of their teams and research teams and colleagues, that schemas are these very fundamental ways of experiencing life. Their themes, their memories, their emotions, their cognitions, their body sensations. It's a whole mixture of experiences. It's not just words in a thought. It's the sensations, it's the emotions, it's the memories. And it's with regard to oneself and one's relationships with other people. So it's intrapersonal and it's interpersonal. And usually developed early, childhood and adolescence, where they really become part of the fabric of the way a person sees the world. We all see the world and ourselves through a lens. And the more that lens has been affected by early adverse incidents, the more difficult it is to cope with problems later. It's not impossible. A lot of our work is about overcoming difficulties by saying it's not impossible, it's just difficult. But it is difficult if people have early maladaptive schemas, such as, oh, and by the way, one of the ways that you know a schema is a schema and not just a discrete belief is if it is very general. It is general over time. A person has these schemas for many, many years, and they experience these schemas in many different life situations, not just at school, but in school, at work, with people, with themselves. It's not just one topic, it covers so much. Here are some examples. I won't elaborate too much. There are 4 different categories with subcategories, like abandonment. I mentioned before about a sense of rejection can be a risk factor. If you have an abandonment schema, that can be a risk factor for rejection. Mistrust and abuse, as one might if that person had grown up being abused. Feeling emotionally deprived, and feeling bad about yourself, bad, defective, shameful, big, schema, that can be a risk factor. And a sense of being alone, alienated, unlovable. And you can see how feeling unlovable can tie into the future. Nobody will ever love me. If nobody ever loves me and I'm alone my whole life, I don't want to live. And they can't even imagine that changing. Feeling dependent and incompetent, feeling like I can't take care of myself. Feeling always vulnerable to harm, always frightened of harm. And then the irony is they may try to solve that perpetual fear of being harmed by harming themselves and ending the suspense. It's as if I can't stand the worrying, I'll just kill myself and end it. But if the schema was being vulnerable to harm, they're now harming themselves. And that's counterproductive, and they don't have to do that. Or they have an underdeveloped sense of themselves. They tend to incorporate the characteristics of other people in their lives at the expense of their own. That isn't so much attached to suicide risk, but these are all different kinds of schemas that you will encounter when you do schema therapy. So I thought I'd mention them all. Sense of failure. I'll just go quickly because we want to take a break very shortly. Feeling entitled. This happens when people are very impulsive. Same thing, insufficient self-control or self-discipline. Impulsivity is a big factor. Having punitive standards. This is the punitive perfectionism, unrelenting standards. If I make a mistake, I'm a terrible person. I don't deserve to be alive. General negativity, being a punishing kind of person. I'm just going to do a couple more slides and then we'll take a very brief break. And you know what? This slide, I think, is a good moment to take a break. So rather than do 2 more slides, I'll wait right here. Let's just take a very brief time, just 5 minutes. Take a breath, take a breather, and we will come back very shortly and resume. Suicidogenic beliefs interact with schemas. So for example, one is the belief that death is the only solution to my problems. So really, the truth is the opposite. Death is actually the problem that makes solutions impossible, rather than death is the solution for the problems. So they believe that suicide is a way to get rid of problems because their problems are unsolvable. We need to help them begin to solve problems, even small ones. If we can help our patients solve even small problems of their everyday life, it helps go against this particular suicidogenic belief. Then there's the one about burden. I feel like a burden to my loved ones. It's better for them if I die. And I can confidently tell you that in at least 99% of the situations, the bigger burden for the family is if the person completes a suicide. So if I think I'm a burden to my family, they're better off if I die. The truth is probably that if I die, that's the bigger burden if I kill myself. Or if you hate yourself, I hate myself and I deserve to die. This is a very difficult suicidogenic belief, and it ties into the schema of unlovability and defectiveness because self-hatred is hard to overcome. Usually it has to do with things in the past that a person is ashamed of. And though we cannot magically snap our fingers and make difficult, painful, shameful things in the past go away, we can help the person to try to have a better future, to try to be a better person for the future, to make contributions, to take the benefits of what they have learned in life and apply them to other people and in a helpful way. Do something better with your life going forward. I remember one, I'll tell a quick story. I want to cover all the slides, but there's a story I've got to tell you about a patient of mine who really felt ashamed of himself and he wanted to die. He had spent time in prison. He was divorced. He didn't see his kids very often. He was struggling to stay away from alcohol. He wasn't making very much money in his job. He had difficulties, felt very lonely. He just hated himself and thought, there's no point in my being alive. He was about 45 years old. But I knew he really liked American football. So I tried to tell a little story that might make him think about, well, you'll be the judge of what the story says. I said, have you ever seen a football team, go into the locker room at halftime after a very bad first half? Very bad first half. And they go in the locker room and they just don't come out for the second half. They just quit. They don't play the second half. That never happens. The team always comes out for the second half, no matter how bad the first half was. And the coach will say, you can play better. Go out in the second half and play like you're capable of playing. Go out in the second half and do it for the fans. Give them something to cheer about. Go out in the second half, and even if you can't win the game, win the second half. I said, that's like you. You're at halftime in your life. The first half went very badly. Play a better second half. Go out to the field and play a better second half. And that became his battle cry for himself. I've got to play a better second half. It helped him to get away from this sense of I hate myself because of the past, because he was thinking more about how to be a better person in the future. Another suicidogenic belief is the idea that death is the only way to get rid of pain. This is another very difficult one to overcome because, like I said, if you've been in chronic pain, either psychologically or physically, you know it is very difficult to endure. We have to give so much empathy. I mean, we give empathy anyway, but even more for persons who have chronic pain, psychological and physical. We try to find ways to make life worthwhile without resorting to ending it. How can you make your life worthwhile even though you are in pain? How can you give yourself a little bit of a rest, a little bit of joy within life? That is our mission. And 5 and 6 go together because they both represent failures of communication. In number 5, the belief is about suicide as a test. I will try suicide, and if my loved one really loves me, they will rescue me. Or number 6, I'm so angry at this person that I will kill myself to get revenge on that person, and they will feel guilty forever because they caused me to kill myself. In both of those cases, we as clinicians want to work on improving the patient's communication. You do not have to try to kill yourself to communicate your fear of abandonment. You do not have to kill yourself to communicate your anger. There are ways you can tell people, I feel abandoned by you. I feel mistreated by you. I'm angry with you. And try to work things out verbally if you possibly can. But do not hurt yourself to communicate this. I'm making it sound very simple. It's not, but for our time interest, I want to give you just a very brief summary. Let's talk about more about treatment. I've given you some ideas, but now specifically. Let's start with well, first of all, we treat the suicide risk directly. It doesn't matter if they have a depression diagnosis or bipolar disorder diagnosis or post-traumatic stress disorder or alcohol dependence or combinations, regardless of the official diagnosis, which we treat. We treat the suicide risk directly by itself. We do not think to ourselves, well, we'll treat the depression. If the depression remits, then the suicide risk remits. We treat the suicide risk directly. And trying to prevent suicide is very much an existential dialogue. So this is where, more than any other topic, cognitive behavioral therapy connects with things like existential psychotherapy. And one of the main writers of that is Irvin Yalom, another famous psychiatrist. If you haven't, and also reading Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, the ability to overcome tremendous hardship and loss and stress and grief and trauma and still have a good life. So these are two very important existential books to incorporate into therapy homework in cognitive behavioral therapy. Now, the Yalom book is more for the clinician, and the Frankel book is more for the patients. The therapeutic relationship is super important under all conditions, and particularly so when it's a matter of life and death. If you have a good connection with your patient, it helps reduce the risk. It does not eliminate the risk. The risk is not zero, but it does reduce the risk, and that's what we can control. We can control probabilities. We can improve chances. We can't guarantee. Part of connecting with someone is validating their subjective sense of emotional pain. We never say to someone, you should not feel that way. It's part of your irrational thinking. That's the simplistic stereotype that some people have about cognitive behavioral therapy. But if you ever see any of the old videos of Aaron T. Beck, he never did that. That was never the methodology of CBT. We validate people's perceptions and pain as the starting point, and then we flex and stretch and find other ways of looking at it to go, to give better perspective. We can offer hope that a patient's pain and suffering can be reduced, yet stay alive. You don't have to die to eliminate your pain or to lower your pain. We can be very attentive in the session. Someone's talking about suicide. We're very, very focused. I remember one patient saying to me how in previous therapy, he could tell his therapist felt threatened. Whenever he would bring up the topic of suicide, the therapist was very uncomfortable, maybe change the subject, other things. And I was leaning in very, very attentive. Now, one might say, well, isn't that positively reinforcing the threat of suicide? No, it's not. Because what you're doing is you're positively reinforcing the relationship more so than you are positively reinforcing the threat of suicide, because you're also connecting with this person when they're succeeding in therapy. You are also giving them your care and your empathy and your attention when they're doing well. It's only a problem if you give attention only when they're suicidal and ignore them when they're doing well. We don't do that either. We give them attention under all conditions. We, of course, want to be able to teach psychological skills. We give a lot of, empathy, but we also teach skills so that they can feel some self-efficacy. Be very attentive when your patient talks about suicide. This takes practice, but I'm sure you do this already. I will just say this to emphasize: remain calm and non-threatened. You may be inside, as I feel, quite anxious, but on the outside, you communicate. Your nonverbal behavior says, I'm here, I'm paying attention, I'm happy you're telling me this, thank you very much for being honest. I am confident that you and I can work together and help you. That's the kind of demeanor that's calm and non-threatened. If you ask about suicide risk early in the appointment, it gives you time. Time is precious. That way, you can strategically give the patient 15 minutes, 20 minutes to cry and be angry and insult the universe and insult God and, talk about anything that they want to talk about. And you know that there's still time. There's still plenty of time in the session to talk about what makes life meaningful, what the future could bring, who cares about them, what they do well, what makes life interesting, even if they're in pain. There's time because you asked about suicide early in the session. Now they can cry and yell and scream if they want to, and you can sit there and listen. And now they know that you have taken the time to hear their story rather than intervene immediately before they've had the chance to tell you everything. Some patients will be unhappy that they haven't had a chance to say everything yet. You're already intervening right away, as you might if you only have 5 minutes, which makes sense. But if you have more time, you can let them have their space. And we try to communicate confidence that we can work. We can solve this. We can't make it perfect. We can't take away your pain, but we can help you to find a reason to care about yourself. We can help you find a reason to care about your future and not want to give it up. We can get there. Maybe not today, but with your collaboration, we can get there. Will you join my team? I'll join your team. Will you join my team? Let's work together. Be very willing to discuss the issue of suicidality directly as the top priority issue, more important than any other topic, and show that you're not afraid to talk about it. Also, a lot of patients are afraid of being put in the hospital. And they are afraid that if they disclose, if they admit that they're having thoughts about suicide, that you will immediately put them in the hospital. I let them know my policy right away. Hospitalization is the last thing we do, not the first thing we do. We do a hospitalization if everything else fails. The first thing we try is a safety plan. Let's you and I talk about how to keep you safe as an outpatient. If you can join me in this plan of safety as an outpatient, you do not have to be in a hospital. This sounds very simple, but I have been guilty of expressing frustration and anger toward a patient when they're suicidal because I haven't had enough sleep, because the patient before that was also suicidal, and I've got too much negativity on my mind. It's not an excuse. It's a description of the phenomenon. There have been times I've grown frustrated and angry with a patient who is suicidal. I still work on this because I'm trying to get down to zero so that I never, ever express anger and frustration, even if I feel it. It's a goal. As I said before, a good therapeutic alliance is a safeguarding factor against suicide, but not a guarantee. You can have a good relationship with someone who still winds up dying. Marsha Linehan and her colleagues in DBT have written about the fact that there really isn't any empirical evidence that staying in a hospital has long-term efficacy. What it has is short-term safety. If someone really is determined to die, or they're having big problems with their medications, and that's part of their impulsivity, then being in a hospital can at least acutely save them. But there was really no evidence that on a long-term basis, that hospitalization is any more efficacious than good outpatient therapy. So let's try for what we call least restrictive means of treatment and not just automatically think about putting someone in the hospital. We want to provide hope, okay? But not just hope, not just wish upon a star, but hope with a plan, plus a plan. That's where a safety plan comes in with specific interventions. So when we create a safety plan, what does that involve? Well, it has several options. First, the tone of the plan has to be positive. It can't be, here's the plan, you will promise not to try suicide or you will be excluded from therapy. Sometimes that's the message that the patient gets, that my therapist will reject me if I cut myself. The plan should be a positive sounding plan. It should be, we are working together to help you value yourself. We are working together to help you cope with your pain in a positive way, not in a destructive way. We are working together to help you get to your future, which could be much better. Positive sounding. And to try to design the plan together, as you'll see. First of all, talk with your patient about early warning signs. What are the early warning signs of becoming suicidal? How do they recognize when they're going down that dark path? Well, sometimes the thoughts about hopelessness come up, or they stop seeing people, they isolate themselves, or they can't sleep. These can be warning signs. Like one of my patients said that she starts imagining her funeral. And when she starts imagining her funeral, she knows, okay, that's an early warning sign. I'm starting to get into that place where I begin to think about taking pills. And if you know an early warning sign, then you can take action. And we'll talk about the action steps very shortly. A warning, though, is that schema activation can happen very quickly. So it isn't always possible to ascertain an early warning sign, because sometimes the schema is very, very quick. Social support. In the safety plan, we think, okay, who are the people in your life that you can communicate with? People in your family, your friends, people in a support group, a therapy support group, maybe your 12-step sponsor if you are in Alcoholics Anonymous, for example. Let's have a list of the people and their contact information so that you do not isolate yourself. You reach out to family and friends. And also mental health professionals. My contact information, your psychiatrist's contact information, your social worker's contact information, your 12-step sponsors' contact information. So you can reach friends and family and the practitioners in your life. You're not alone. How about making use of coping skills? What have we tried so far in therapy to remind yourself at these moments, like having more physical activity? Again, these interventions do not eliminate the risk, but they reduce the risk little by little. It improves the chances the person will remain safe. That's all we can do is improve the chances, but that's worth so much. So having more physical activity, even something like walk the dog. I never walk the dog. My mother walks the dog. You walk the dog. Walk the dog when you're feeling very depressed. That can actually help you. How about self-soothing, but not self-medicated? We don't want people to do things like impair themselves with alcohol and other drugs. That's not an adaptive coping skill, but it could be like using sensory inputs, music that you like, a warm feeling like a warm shower, fragrance that you enjoy that gives you a sense of calm, comfort food. What are the comfort foods that you like? Let's talk about feeding your senses with self-soothing to get through a critical period. It doesn't solve every problem in your life, of course not, but it might get you through a crisis. Writing and rational responding, writing in a journal, doing thought records, stretching your cognitions, not just believing I hate myself and I want to die, but thinking I've got to have a better second half. So in the second half of my football game of my life, what does that mean? How do I want to play a better second half? Let's write about that. And mindfulness, which I'll get to in an upcoming slide. And a final part of the safety plan is reducing access to lethal means. That usually means things like a weapon or pills. So we hope that the patient does not live alone. Sometimes they do. That's a complicating factor. But we can ask them to give possession of a weapon or possession of their pills to a trusted person in the household. And the person in the household can be in charge of distributing the pills at the appropriate time. It's a little bit of extra work, but it's for safety so that the patient doesn't have all the pills at one time, which is a risk for overdose. So these are the elements of a safety plan. It can be all on one page or on one phone screen or one computer file. Specific techniques. Pros and cons of living and dying. It sounds very, very simple, but it's very interesting to see what patients will say. And not just pros and cons for living and dying for themselves, because they might say, there are lots of advantages to dying for me, but not many advantages for the people in my family. They would be without me, and I've been the strong one all along, and I'm tired of being the strong one. But if I go, who's going to take care of them? So let's talk about the pros and cons of your death on the family. Or it could also be about now versus the future. They might say, I wish I were dead right now, but I wish I could wake up again in 5 years. Tom Ellis, my colleague, actually had a patient who said, I wish I were dead, but not forever. And they both laughed. It was a morbid laughter. What he meant was, right now at this time in his life, he was in the middle of a scandal, and his life was a mess because of a scandal. He wished he were dead, but then maybe come back in 5 years after everyone forgets the scandal. But you don't get that. If you die, you die. So there may be a lot of advantages in your mind to being dead today, but a lot of drawbacks to being dead 5 years from now. You may want to have those next 40 years after that. So let's talk about pros and cons. And when you talk about pros and cons, a lot of strange ideas get elicited. People say things like, well, it's an advantage if I die because my parents will be happier. Is there evidence for that? Have you asked them? Can we invite your parents to a session and ask them? Because that could be a faulty belief. The finality of death is very difficult to comprehend, but one way of comprehending it is to say, what do you think you'll miss if you die? And for young people in particular who fear missing out on things, missing experiences, this idea, okay, you're 25 years old. If you die at the age of 25, name 3 things that you'll miss if you were 26. Name 3 things you'll miss if you were 27. 3 things you'll miss if you were 28. And they usually stop at that point. Say, no, keep going. Keep going until you're 88. Three more things. I don't know what I'm going to miss. I can't predict the future. Yes, you can. You can say things like, well, my sister's wedding, going on a trip abroad, learning to play guitar, which I always promised myself I would do. These are things you're going to miss if you die at the age of 25. Let's talk about what you will miss every year going forward. It's a very difficult thing to really sustain because people want to get out of the assignment after 3 or 4 years. Keep going. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You spend a half an hour talking about what you're going to miss. It begins to make a point. Anytime you can teach your patient to delay acting on impulse, to procrastinate suicide, put off suicide, because there's something else you have to do right now, like look at your safety plan, talk to your best friend, talk to your psychiatrist, walk the dog. It could be a long-term delay because I still haven't finished my college degree, and I promised my father before he died I would finish college. I haven't finished college yet. I have to finish college before I die. I have to try to patch things up and reconcile with my sister before I die. I have to learn guitar before I die. What are the things you must do before you die? You haven't done them yet. Delay until you do these things. A patient might say, well, are you saying that if I reconcile with my sister and I finish university and I play guitar, then I have your permission to die? And I say, if you do all those things, come back and talk to me. I don't think you're going to want to die at that point because you will have created meaningful connections in your life. And that is one of our jobs in therapy, create more meaningful connections for you. Help the patient become more active. It's hard if you're depressed to be active. People say, I've got no energy. I can't do anything. We have to validate and empathize with the feeling, but not necessarily with the strategy. Help them become more active because all else being held equal, the person who's more active is less depressed. And what should those activities be? Activities that increase a sense of mastery, pleasure, and connection with other people. And sometimes you can do all 3 at once, like someone playing guitar for their friends. That's all 3. They're feeling a sense of mastery in playing guitar. They enjoy it, and they're connecting with other people. That's the best kind of activity. It's hard to see it when you're depressed, but it's one we emphasize as therapists. Teach the methods of mindfulness. That's a lecture in itself. I can't get into the details. I'll give you a slide on that coming up. Try to imagine a better future and how to get there. Like flash forwards. We know about flashbacks in post-traumatic stress. How about flash forwards? Could you envision your future? One intervention I used along these lines was, the patient was about maybe in her early 30s. I said, imagine a biography of your life. Okay, just imagine a book about your life. Right now, you're in chapter 8. Chapter 8 is awful. Chapter 8 is painful. Chapter 8 is you are at a low point in your life. You can't see your future. You feel alone. You're angry with yourself. But guess what? Your biography has 22 chapters. Are you curious to know what's going to happen in the next 14 chapters? Oh, I can't see those chapters. I can't see that. Well, but are you curious to get to those 14 chapters? If you die now, you die at chapter 8 in the worst chapter, when maybe the next 14 chapters show that you come back, good things happen, you regain a sense of yourself, of hope, new people come into your life. Are you curious to get there? 14 more chapters. You're only at chapter 8. It's the worst chapter. If somebody reads this book, they say, oh, this poor person. But they know that there's more to the book. How about you? Encourage writing. The writing can be a journal. It can be an activity schedule. It can be thought records of the sort that you see in early Beck writings, letters to people, creative writing. If we look at the work of James Pennebaker, even when people write negative things, they have physiological calming effect. They're expressing themselves. They're not, and when you express yourself on paper, when you write it, it's slower. And so you can evaluate it. When you're thinking, it's like a centrifuge. It's like spinning, spinning, spinning. It goes too fast. You can't even evaluate it. When you write it, it's slower. It's a little bit distant. You're using more of your brain. You're using visual cortex because you see it. You're using motor cortex because you're using your hands to write. There's more, redundant systems in the engineering of your brain. It's better to write even negative things than to simply think negative things. And when you begin to write, you collect data on yourself that you can then bring into your therapy sessions, and we can evaluate and talk about it in a way that we can't if you just think it and it disappears, if it evaporates, never to be seen again. It affects you forever, but the words are gone. If you write them, the words are not gone. We can talk about them. Encourage little positive behavioral changes, like to create new routines. Maybe like a new routine is you be the one to walk the dog. This will begin a positive feedback loop of feeling a little bit more energy, a little more useful, a little more hopeful. It doesn't solve everything, but it begins a positive feedback loop. And we could say, borrowing a bit from Sir Isaac Newton, that for every vicious cycle, there is an equal and opposite positive feedback loop. And when people get depressed, we can pretty much guarantee that they are thinking in vicious cycles. Let's convert that into a positive feedback loop. Many times that begins with a positive behavior. And I will tell patients, here's a therapist trade secret. You want to hear a therapist trade secret? Therapists know that even when they get depressed, and we do get depressed, therapists get depressed, we're human too, believe it or not. We know that it helps us to feel better if we help somebody else. That helps us feel better. You can try that too. Part of your positive behavior could be help somebody else and see what happens. See how that affects your day. See how that affects your quality of sleep. Don't take my word for it. Try it for yourself and then come back and talk about it. A hope kit might be difficult to do with people who are displaced because they've had to leave so many things behind. But perhaps they do have things on, if they've been able to preserve their laptop or their phone. They have memorabilia, photos, old emails, mementos of the past that signify to them that they're important, that they have connections with other people. I'll tell people here, if you have old holiday cards, Christmas cards, birthday cards in your drawer where people say how much they love you and you're fantastic and you're awesome and they wish you a good year. You may be very depressed right now, but read all those cards. That's part of your hope kit, reminders of your life and times. Work on improving problem-solving skills, one little problem at a time. It's a natural extension of the pros and cons of living and dying. I'm going to go quicker because time is of the essence. And for those who have difficulty with specific autobiographical recall, a very good assignment is begin to write your autobiography little by little. And it doesn't have to be chronological. It could be a memory when you were 5 years old, a memory of when you were 17 years old, memory of when you were 38 years old. It could be little images of your life, little stories of your life that you can then later on cut and paste and put it together if you want. But let's write about the things you've been through, the good and the bad, the parts where you liked yourself and the parts where you didn't, the parts where you had love in your life, the parts where you've lost love in your life. Let's understand where you've been. This is a way of getting out of the black hole and looking at where they've been. Because if you look at where they've been, you learn about the specifics. You learn about the lessons learned about life that can be applied to the future. It's a long assignment. It's a repeating assignment. Mindfulness is its own topic. I'm not an expert on mindfulness, but part of being mindful is knowing how to sit within the moment focus on your breathing, and create a safe space in which you can confront your pain. So just sort of sit with yourself with compassion and respect for yourself. To not just feel pain, but to deal with pain as a person that you value, to deal with pain as someone who has validity as a human being. Give them permission to have their painful experiences. Another stereotype, inaccurate stereotype of cognitive behavioral therapy is that we shun negative emotions. We essentially say, don't feel angry, don't feel guilty, don't feel panic. You shouldn't feel negative things. As Robert Leahy will say quite well in his works, negative emotions are part of the richness of life. It gives contrast and meaning to the positives and helps us grow and learn. So give your patients permission to have their painful experiences. Bear witness to their pain and connect. Teach them self-compassion, especially if they have survivor guilt. And I'll give you an example of a rational response for that as we get to the end. I got to go quickly. I'm sorry. Use, if you can, if you work on yourself with mindfulness, it's very valuable for the therapist. Helping a patient to choose to live is a process. It's rarely an epiphany. It will not go away in one intervention, but risk can be lowered little by little, one intervention at a time, especially if they practice skills and do their homework. Very quickly, here are some examples, and you'll have access to these slides, so I will not talk in depth about these because I still have 20 more slides. These are empirically supported interventions for suicidal patients. There are many, including short-term versions, longer-term versions, single-session versions. You're aware of DBT, of course, and there are others. And I'm sure there are others outside of what I know in my English-speaking world. Special issues. So we'll wrap up with these 4 special issues. What about seeing people after they've tried suicide? Some therapists refuse. If you've tried suicide, I won't see you anymore. I disagree with that approach. I think if somebody has survived suicide, great, thank God. Come back to therapy. Let's try again, but now with a revised treatment plan. Reconnect that relationship. Revise the treatment plan. Like I had one patient who refused to talk about her sexual abuse. She said it would make her more suicidal if she talked about the sexual abuse. So I respected that and said, okay, we will not talk about your sexual abuse. And then she tried to take an overdose of pills. And at that point I said, you know, the only reason why I said we could avoid talking about the sexual abuse is because I thought it would keep you safe. That failed. You weren't safe. You tried to overdose. So now for us to work together, we have to talk about everything, including the sexual abuse. So I welcomed her back to therapy with a revised treatment plan. If you can get other people involved, significant others in the patient's life, that helps too. Following a suicide attempt, get the parent, get the spouse, get the adult child, get a good friend also into therapy to be a facilitator. Here's a chain analysis. Help the patient learn about how they arrived at the suicidal behavior. It can be part of their safety plan going forward. So an example would be looking at the situation. Okay, this could be a refugee, somebody in a new home. They don't have a job anymore. They're alone. They don't know anybody. And they have thoughts about, oh, I was depressed even before the disaster, but at least I had a familiar life in my home in Ukraine. Now I'm lost and alone, and I'm sad and angry and frustrated. And, you know, so they now take all their pills that they were being prescribed for sleep. But then immediately thought that they were scared, regretful. They tell the host in the home that they're living. They call the police. And now the person's worried that now they'll be told to leave the home of their host. They've made things worse for themselves. They've created a vicious cycle. This isn't meant to depress somebody. It's meant to educate someone about the pathway that these actions of suicide have an antecedent and they have a consequence. And the more that you understand that, the more that you'll be able to see early warning signs and prevent acting impulsively. So this is a good thing to work on in a session. How about non-suicidal self-injury? I'll go through it very quickly. This is where people cut themselves and burn themselves. Some things are very obvious like that. Some are less obvious. Some people try to harm themselves through multiple body piercings. I'm not saying that if people have multiple body piercings, it necessarily means that they're engaging in suicidal behavior. I'm saying that there are some people who express their need for self-harm through body piercings. And it can be disguised as art, but it really is psychological, or it's both. Same thing with tattoos or deliberate exposure to the cold. People who walk outside, it's freezing, they don't wear a coat. Maybe it's because they're bragging. Oh, look how strong and tough I am. But maybe it's also self-harming. You have to wonder. Always assess for the risk of death, because even if they don't try to hurt them, to kill themselves, they may underestimate. Ask them, when you cut yourself, are you trying to die? And if not, what are your reasons? What's the purpose of harming yourself? Let's understand the function of the harming. Maybe it's for self-punishment. Maybe it's because they feel numb and dissociated with trauma. They want to feel something. Maybe it's because they want to obscure their emotional hurt. And in their mind, the best way to obscure the emotional hurt is to have physical pain. Let's understand that and empathize. So there's the question, what's the function of the harming? What are the events? What are the triggering events that led to the self-harm? What are the situational antecedents? Because again, it's part of understanding early warning signs. And also schema activation. You know, a person might be thinking, everything's fine, until someone I care about didn't reply to my text message for 3 hours. All right, that's inconvenient, but if I have an abandonment schema, if I have a defectiveness schema, if I feel unlovable, suddenly my loved one not responding to my text for 3 hours feels like a personal rejection and an abandonment. I might feel like life is not worth living, but it might just be they were just postponed, they were delayed, they were in their car driving, couldn't respond. Normal things. It's not because you're unlovable, but they might try suicide. There's an addictive quality to things like cutting yourself or burning yourself. We have to understand that. It's almost as hard to stop that as it is to stop an addiction. We have to treat the urge to self-harm almost like an urge to drink or use a drug. It's that powerful. We strive for harm reduction. We may not be able to get someone to stop self-harming completely, but you know what? If we can reduce it, that's beneficial. We really want them to achieve their emotional goals without harming themselves through words, through writing, through positive behaviors, through interacting with people in a caring way, through helping other people. You know, the therapist trade secret. Hey, if a therapist is depressed, help somebody else. You'll feel better. If you feel like you want to cut yourself, don't cut yourself. Do a favor for somebody. Give a compliment to someone. Send a text message just saying, I'm thinking of you. Hope you're having a nice day. I really care about you. Hope to see you soon. Send that text message. Don't hurt yourself. Do something nice for someone. As Marsha Linehan has talked about, you can also use safer alternative behaviors. Like rather than cutting yourself, hold ice cubes. It hurts. It gives you that pain stimulus that you're looking for, but you won't have to get medical attention. You won't have to damage body tissue. You won't have to go to hospital or mark yourself with red washable markers to have symbolic cutting, but not real cutting. Eventually, we hope that they won't even do this symbolic cutting. We hope they won't even have to hold the ice cubes. We're shaping them behaviorally from self-harm to pain but no harm to symbolic self-harm. You know, we're going up the ladder of function. How about using self-soothing behaviors? That's the sensory things, the comfort foods, the music, the fragrance. You know, give your wind chimes, stare at a candle for mindfulness. Sounds silly, it's not. This is all about self-soothing, calming yourself, going from sympathetic nervous system activity to parasympathetic without cutting yourself. Here are all those examples I just said: the music, nature sounds, fragrance, a warm blanket, having a cup of tea while reading a favorite book that you like, creature comforts, as we call them. Here's another chain analysis for a non-suicidal self-injury. Like a person knows that their friends got together, even though the friends said they were unavailable. So I'm alone. The thoughts, they don't want to be with me. They don't want to hang out with me. Nobody cares about me. Overgeneralize. I'm rejected. I'm sad. I'm anxious. I'm angry. So I cut myself 3 times. And then I feel relief, but I'm still alone and I'm still hiding. and I feel ashamed that I'm more isolated. It's not this simple. We can't just like read it ding, ding like that. It's a process, but we help people think about the connections, the links in the chain. And when you are aware of the links in the chain, you can intervene earlier. You can intervene at the situation. Maybe the person, rather than thinking nobody cares about me, they'd say, well, I'm going to text my friends and say, can I join you? I didn't know you were getting together. Can I come out and see you guys? Probably the answer is yes. They just have to give it a chance. Grief and existential issues. How do I cover that in 5 minutes? Trauma challenges the full range of human emotions and beliefs. It challenges us deep in our core. And meaning of life issues are embedded. They're critical. They're part of CBT for trauma and CBT when someone is feeling suicidal. I mentioned Irvin Yalom before. He talked about how, no matter how much empathy you give someone, you can't do their grieving for them, and you can't take away their loss, but you can bear witness, which can mean a lot. You can help the patients find meaning in their survival and their everyday experience. And you can still help them to connect with the people who are still here. They may be so despondent over someone who died, but there are still people here that they can connect with. We have to be prepared to deal with our own mortality issues as part of working with people who are traumatized and escaping from war. Pain is felt as being physical. It's a real physical pain. And the pain of complicated traumatic grief is acute and chronic. It's acute because it comes in waves. You can have almost like a panic attack. You can have a grief attack out of the blue. You can be just having a normal day, and get a grief attack because something reminded you of your lost loved one. And grief is also chronic because you cannot reverse the loss. And suicidal thoughts may emerge as a way to escape from this seemingly inescapable and permanent pain. It's argued by Frumkin et al. As being the ultimate experiential avoidance, suicide, to escape all experience. Our job as therapists is to validate that pain, but introduce people to the benefits of new experience that add meaning to self and life. We have to be aware of the fact that the ability to mourn, a normal mourning and grieving process, is impaired by traumatization. It's more complex. And regarding religion, one patient may have their faith shattered by events like war and displacement and death of loved ones, or their faith may be a protective factor. Let's not assume one or the other. Let's listen carefully. Is their faith shattered? Is their faith helping them? Do they have faith? Are they more secular existentialists? Let's listen and join them where they are. We can sometimes feel very helpless, but let's remind ourselves just being there and bearing witness is doing something valuable. We show the patient that their life has meaning to us. That's a starting point. We hope it will also have meaning to them. Let's allow our patients to have anger and guilt. It's a normal reaction to abnormal situations. So let's not deny them their right to be angry and guilty. But we help them, remember, broaden, expand their experience. Their life, their emotions are not just anger and guilt and loss and grieving. Their emotions can also be love and curiosity and relaxation and hope. It's possible, even if the anger and the guilt and the bereavement are still there. Can we possibly have rational responses for grieving, for loss? I mean, how do you have a rational, you can have a rational response for something like, I failed my examination, now I feel like a failure. And the rational response could be, a lot of people fail the exam the first time. You can take it a second time. It's a big inconvenience because now you have to wait 6 months before you get your license. I know you feel embarrassed, but you can get your license in 6 months and have your career. That's a reasonable, rational response. But you can't say in a rational response, your loved one will come back to life in 6 months. How could you possibly have rational responses for grief? Here are a couple of humble examples. So one automatic thought, I should have been the one to die, not my spouse. Therefore, I should die now. But a rational response could be, the reason I'm thinking this way is because of my deep sense of love and responsibility. Truthfully, nobody should have died, and I should not die now. My dear spouse's source of solace may have been the knowledge that I am safe. So my life is the best gift I can give to my spouse. It's worth preserving. It's one example. A second, my life is now destroyed. There's nothing left to live for. Okay, I'm in deep pain, and therefore it's difficult to see the purpose for my life. But this does not mean that the purpose is not there at all. I can find it. I can create it. This is just an example of what you can do with rational responding, even with things as dramatic and painful as grief and loss. And we have to take care of ourselves because we form strong attachments with people who may choose to die. I will self-disclose and tell you that in my 35 years of being a therapist, since my postdoctoral fellow, 35 years since I first began working with Beck, I have had 3 patients kill themselves, 3. And I can tell you the dates. It was I won't give you all the dates. It was 1996, 2009, and last year. And I still have vivid recollections of all of them. And they're painful and they're raw. It's a tough part of our work, but what we do is so meaningful because we also help so many people. We can't be their guardian angels 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Yet some people may expect this of us. It's not a realistic expectation. We may worry about being blamed. Sometimes family will blame us. We may blame ourselves. It makes sense to look at yourself and say, could I do something different in the future? But it also makes sense to say, I'm not God. And as long as you have made a good faith effort to help your patients, and you have documented your good faith effort, you're not blameworthy. And even if you say to yourself, well, there's something else I could have done, maybe you might have done something different in that moment, but does that guarantee the person would have been alive in a year? We just don't know. And it's not totally in our control. We're just human beings. We have to give ourselves compassion. I've had to work on myself and give myself a lot of compassion. After my first experience with a patient's suicide, I sought out therapy of my own. I went to therapy because I was finding that I was having a difficult time coping with new patients who had suicide risk. And I thought, how can I pay attention to them if I'm so focused on a person who died? But it was very, very helpful. And I would recommend it to anybody. Almost done. So here are the problem responses. If we have patients who threaten suicide, we can withdraw emotionally, feel helpless, even feel resentment and anger toward a patient. I've had that experience. We can lose confidence in our abilities, or try to rescue and be over-involved, try to be the guardian angel. There's nothing evil about that. It's just not possible. But what are some good things, some remedies? Be self-aware, assess your own thoughts, monitor your own thoughts, share your thoughts and feelings with a trusted colleague, engage in self-compassion, remember the purpose of the work, because highly stressful moments with patients that you handle with grace and care can result in great healing, theirs and yours. So I try to give myself a rational response when I have the automatic thought, oh my goodness, this person might die. Oh my goodness, I don't know what to do. Oh my goodness, I can almost picture the family blaming me. And my rational response is, this is an opportunity to help. You're being called upon to bear witness. You're being called upon to connect with this person. Be that person. It's a privilege to be that person. This person is trusting you to be that person. Live up to that trust. This is an opportunity. Embrace this moment. You could really help them. And I use that rational response to help me cope. And, connect with others in your life. Branch out. Make sure that you have people who are feeding what you need. And do activities you always enjoy, things that contrast with being a helper. So do things that are creative, do things that are for sports, do things that are crafts, work in your garden, do a lot of cooking, write poetry, sing in the shower, write your autobiography, do feng shui and rearrange your furniture, walk the dog, do things for yourself that are not just about being a caregiver, but that feed you. All right, a hopeful note. As I mentioned with the people that I have lost, we know the people we've lost, but we may never really fully know or appreciate the number of patients we have saved. So when a patient says to you, maybe they come back 2 years later, you really saved my life, they may not be exaggerating, but you'll never quite know because we don't have the ability to go to an alternate universe where you're not there. And we see who would have died by suicide because you weren't there. But in some sort of psychological science fiction, there is that other universe where you're not there. And you might see that there are 25 people who would have died if it were not for you. So 25 people that you saved and 3 that you're only human, you can't save everybody. Every time we help someone choose to live, we're helping other people too. We help their loved ones. We're helping them now. We're helping them in the future. And borrowing from the Talmud, it's if you save a single life, it is as if you have saved the entire world. So I cannot thank you enough for your attention to all of this. I have left no time for questions. What I can stay a little bit longer now and take some questions if that's okay, or just get a list of them sent to me somehow so I can try to answer them. Let me ask Ego right now. Ego, do you have a suggestion? Should I spend another 5 or 10 minutes trying to answer a couple of questions now? What would be your suggestion?
Znaczy może ja powiem, pytań nie ma, są tylko ogromne.
There are actually no questions, but there are many words of gratitude for being so exhaustive on the topic, and there's a lot of words of thanks.
I must not have clicked on my translation because I didn't do that. I'll say this. Please feel free to contact me at this email address, newmanc@penn.upenn.edu. If you feel that you do not want to write in English, I will just put it through a Google translation and I'll do my best. But I do want to be able to be available. And I know I did not use my time as effectively as I'd like to, so there's no time left.
Well, I just want to say that Joanna said that there was no really questions as such, but just words of gratitude and really appreciating what you've done. Thank you so much. You helped me so much. I'm seeing a client, suicidal client, in a few minutes' time. This really is a great guidance for me. These sort of comments. Yes, this was like very fast-moving presentation with such an important and yet such a difficult subject. And thank you very much because you've done it in such a structured way. We can probably meet again to spend more time on this. And if you're willing, Cory, because I can see you nodding, then we will get in touch with you, not only with 1 or 2 questions, but really with perhaps doing it again and really just ponder about what we're doing, because this is really hard stuff.
There are so many stories I can tell that if I have more time, I will elaborate on those stories.
Yes, and these are universal stories, probably. These are universal issues, but as you've been warning us, in a time of such a drama like what is happening now in Ukraine, this is the risk of experiencing all of these problems. It's even greater. So honestly, very, very important subject. We were wondering whether to add this to our series of presentation, but no doubt this is one of the most important. So we will get back to you, Cory. And many thanks for your wonderful presentation. Dziękujemy też.
Dobry wieczór.
Thank you.
Dobry wieczór and dobry wieczór. Thanks a lot.